Thank you for listening to Torah Media Atlanta. Won't you consider making a donation to help support this important work? Just go to TorahMediaAtlanta.com and click on the donate link. Thank you very much.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Those of you who were not here last week, I believe the class is online. It is at TorahMediaAtlanta.com. I was just informed that 2 weeks ago's was cut off. Hopefully last week's was not. Torah Media Atlanta, T-O-R-A-H, Media Atlanta, all one word, .com, and follow the tabs till you get to Cole Institute Graduate, and there should be a link to each one of the 5 or 6 classes that we've had so far.
Good.
Just in case you've missed it, just in case you'd like to review. It's a great way. Not everybody can make it every week, including myself. And it's a great way of reviewing or filling in what you've lost out on. In fact, last week was actually a very interesting class, if I may say so myself. A little off topic, but very on topic. And if you can figure that out. Okay. As we turn the pages, just kidding. As we moved on to the next verse last week, we're actually going to move backwards. We are going to progress by regressing. And I'd like to spend a few minutes on Pasuk Gimel because we did not give it its due research and due questioning. We jumped to Dalid because there was something that I wanted to discuss last week which I never ended up discussing, which is the relationship between light and darkness and the Jewish people and Hellenistic culture. But we may not get there today, but being that we'll probably be on this verse next Hanukkah, so we could probably speak about it next year.
What page are we on?
What page are we on? 1 or 2. We're actually in our Matsudo Chamashim, we are on page 4.
Thank God.
Do you have those pencils? Did you write in the book? Okay, great. No. Is it a pencil?
Yes.
Not a pen? Okay.
Would you like a pen?
No, I want to write in the book.
Pencil.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so Pasuk Gimel. Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or Vayi Or. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Great. Are we ready to go on to verse 4? So, I do believe we began questioning this verse. If anybody would like to remind everyone else what the particular questions were, and if you don't remember what the questions are, so let's think about it now. What are the questions on this verse? Whoa. We're on 3.
Why does God have to talk at all?
Good.
And who is he speaking to?
Question 1 is God speaking. What does it mean that God speaks? Number 2 is to whom is he speaking? There ain't nobody out there.
What is light? Light is we know.
Good. What is the light that we are referring to? Excellent.
Maybe he was talking to the future. Talking for the future.
Talking for the future. What do you mean?
Talking to us.
Talking to us. Okay.
Talking for us.
Talking for
We
us.
weren't here yet, but he knew we were going to be here.
Okay.
And there had to be a story for us to live by.
So he was telling us, let there be light. Now,
I think so.
what would we do when we would hear the command, let there be light? Do we have the capacity of creating light?
No. Depends on what the light is.
Depends what the light is. If the light is the light as we know it, the answer is no.
May not have been. Maybe the
Yes,
light
you can screw in a light bulb. Yes, that is true.
Maybe the light was the light of life, the light that was going to begin life. Let there be light. Something was going to begin to happen. This was the beginning of something happening.
That is correct.
You said last week we need to have light to be able to see what we are observing.
Correct. So light being the first of the creations, or the process of organizing the chaos that we described in the previous verse clearly would need the first step being an element of clarity. Why? Anybody recall why you need clarity first?
So you can see what so you can understand what you're about to organize or to put it in order.
Good. So what kind of clarity do you need?
There has to be a beginning.
Clarity on
The light is the beginning.
Perceive it.
We have to know what we're looking at. Correct. We have to know what the essence of the thing that we're looking at is, and we have to know how it is distinguished from the other things. And additionally, once we understand that, then we can understand its role in the bigger picture of things. So we need some element of clarity before we begin a process of organization. Similar to walking into a room that's a mess, trying to figure out where things are going to go. So you'll set up a whole shelving system, you'll set up lateral files, you'll set up file folders, you'll set up everything, and it's not going to help you. Because the very first thing you need to do is figure out what's in the room that needs to be organized, and then work on a classification system to organize it. Otherwise, working backwards is not going to get you anywhere. So we need to figure out what we're looking at and what it is and what it isn't.
I was just going to say that everything you say sounds great, but it's almost like you have a light when you're studying Torah. It's like that's the light that has to come on. It's the whole knowledge of what we're going to be learning for the rest of our lives.
That is true. That Torah provides us with an element of defining the essence of things in order for us to be able to organize our own lives to figure out what the values of Torah are and how we are to orient ourselves around it. Excellent.
So there's another
Why did God need that?
He didn't, but we did.
Why did he need it? He did not need anything. In fact, he created an entire template for us to learn from, and in order for us to be able to derive lessons for our own lives. And that's why he provided us with an instruction book called the Torah. So clearly, when we're studying these verses, we need to ask ourselves, how does this apply to my life? And does this teach me anything in relation to how I am to do things? So God creates a template for us to view, understand, and hopefully implement.
So the next question I would ask is, why would God have to say, let there be light, and there was light? Why wouldn't it just say God created light or
Good.
made light? Why
Excellent question.
Two-step process.
Excellent question. The verse says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. Why not just say, God created light, period, end of story? Great question. Okay, any other questions?
No,
Before we
answer
attend-
to that.
Did you come here for answers?
Left there.
What type of light? Spiritual light, physical light, and that illusion we talked about.
Correct. So we already discussed, we had a long discussion about light and about my experiences in Dialogue in the Dark, and understanding how sometimes light is blinding and darkness is illuminating. For further clarification, see me after class.
That was a great story.
And that clearly the light that we're talking about can be one or the other, and we'll have to see as things develop which one it really is. Or maybe perhaps it's both. Yes?
If you say God created the world for us and gave us the Torah as a blueprint or a way of life, could the light be consciousness for us, our consciousness, so that we can understand, or that there is an awareness?
I would say the word that perhaps you're referring to is clarity. Awareness. To be aware of the things around us, to be able to understand the world that we live in, and to try to make sense out of it to whatever degree that we can. Yeah?
That could be understanding, is what you're saying?
Understanding, awareness, clarity, they're all related words, and perhaps all of it is included. Any other questions before we move on? Great. Okay, so let's take this pasuk apart. Let's take this verse apart. Vayomer Elokim. So the question was asked, does God speak? Number 2, to whom is God speaking? So the very first thing we need to understand is that the Torah speaks in the language of man. If you recall, last week we spoke about the concept of analogy, we spoke about the concept of a mashal, of a parable, and very often we're going to encounter topics, subject matter, ideas, concepts that are so foreign to us that we have a very difficult time connecting with. However, if you provide me with an example that I have experienced, then perhaps I have a bridge to a concept or an idea that I've never experienced before. And similarly, the Torah describes realities that are perhaps foreign to us. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult to describe things in terms of what they really are. We're going to have to describe things in terms of the way we can relate to them. Now, not every idea is going to be pulled down to our limited understanding, but at the same time, it's phrased in terms that kind of give us an idea of what's going on. So, here's a classic example where God speaks. So, when we talk about anthropomorphisms in the Torah, namely, when it talks about God's hand, and it talks about God speaks, and it talks about God looks, right? God does not have eyes, God does not have hands, God does not have ears. He doesn't have all these senses that a human being is created with. So to say that God sees out of his eyes is an impossibility. And yet, sight, if we had to describe to somebody what sight is, sight.
Light waves hitting a portion of the eye.
Okay, so that's a scientific understanding. Let's get more basic. What is sight?
What we see.
What we see. Good. So it's one of our senses that allow us to be able to take in information from outside of us through visual stimuli. Anybody disagree? Okay? So the different senses that we have are ways of getting information that's outside of us into us. So we talk about sight, we talk about hearing, we talk about touching, right? The sense of taste is also to take things in. Now what about speech? Speech is a very interesting thing because it's using the mouth that is a sense. But the sense that comes from the mouth is taste, which is taking something from outside of us and bringing it in. Speech sounds like it's a reversal. It's taking something inside of us and actually bringing it forth into the world around us. So in a certain sense, the element of speech is actually a method by which a human being can create. It's not a sense, but it uses the mouth, which we associate with a sense of taste, but here the mouth is actually being used to reverse the process. Instead of taking something from outside in, it's taking something from inside out. Yes?
Yes, however, the speech says one still has to be able to take it in.
Take what in? Breathe?
Down in, to be able to use the mouth.
Why is that? Perhaps. But again, the concept of speech is to be able to take something that's within us, regardless of how I refine my speech and the ability of communication, but ultimately speech is a creation of something that was not in this world before, but through my speech I have created.
So every sentence you utter is a creation.
That's correct. Now, the concept of speech is, in essence, the ability to bridge spirituality to physical reality. Now, I'll explain. Because if we think about what speech is a medium. Speech is a medium. I have an idea in my mind, in my consciousness. Is that idea physical? No. Can it be touched, felt, seen? No. And yet, that thought can be turned into tangible reality through the medium of speech. Now that's astounding, if you think about it. Well, that's the perception of the listener. If there's nobody there, you have still created. Don't give me the tree in the forest analogy. Whether or not someone hears it, the reality of speech has been created. And therefore, speech is man's ability to take spiritual realms and transform it into physical realms.
What do you mean by spiritual?
Well, you explain to me what a thought and an idea is.
A thought, well, I mean, I can explain it in scientific terms. I would say neuro...
True. True. But can it be...
But it's a concept. I mean, how is it spiritual?
Because it's an idea. An idea is not tangible. It's not something that has any physical reality to it. Now, somebody that wants to measure brain activity can see the neurotransmitters and the synapses and et cetera, firing away, but that doesn't mean anything. That just means that the brain is active. But the concept that I have in my mind that I want to articulate through the medium of speech, that idea is a spiritual idea.
It is spiritual, not necessarily godlike, but non-physical.
That's correct, which is spiritual.
The speech itself is not physical either.
That's right.
Yes, it is. Because as soon as I utter it, this little thing can take my thought and concretize it. The fact that there are sound waves being created, they're bouncing off your eardrums, and you are able to perceive it. You can't see it, but you could hear it. There are different ways of sensing physical reality. You have different senses. But it is a physical reality that I am able to perceive in a physical world.
I guess I'm still stuck in spiritual, because when I think of thought, I think of it as conscious.
You can call it what you want. Conscience is also spiritual.
So you're equating that with, okay.
Yeah. We'll call it the soul. We'll call it the mind. We're not the brain. The brain is a muscle that's in the cranium. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the mind. Now, is the mind in the brain? We can talk about this for the next year if you want to talk about it. Okay? I know some people, I was going to say, I know some people that... Let's not call it. No naming people. Yeah.
Okay. So suppose someone does not have the ability to speak, but he still has thoughts, and he puts those thoughts out in other ways besides speech.
Yes. So writing is another form of creating a reality, but we'll call it the classic form. We'll call it the standard form of communication is through speech. So clearly there are ways of communicating thoughts into reality via other media. But classically, speech is the medium of communication. Now, it's not just communication vis-a-vis two people. It is a means of taking an idea and giving it concrete dimensions, right? What we would call reality. Thought, on some level, has reality. Speech has a deeper level of reality. And what's the third level of reality? Action. Thank you. Thought, speech, action are the three levels of taking a thought, an idea, or even a forethought, and developing it into what we would call reality. So when we're talking about God speaking, clearly what is meant to be communicated over here is a method of creating. Speech creates. In fact, it's very interesting. We spoke last week about the Hebrew language, about words meaning things. Well, the interesting thing is that the word for speech called, anybody know what the word for speech is? Starts with a dalet. Good. Diber, or lidaber, vayidaber. We have that very often in Chumash. Or midaber. So dalet beis reish is the word that describes the action of speech. Well, that word serves as a noun as well, not just as a verb. Anybody know what a davar is? No? Well, davar Torah is the speech of Torah, but a davar is a thing.
A thing?
Thing, like an object. So the very word for speech is the word for object. Well, hopefully that makes sense now. And if not, speak to me after class. So, when we're speaking about the concept of speech and the concept of bringing something into reality, then we speak about God taking things and creating reality through the same method, which is Vayomer Elokim, God said, Yehi Or, let there be light. Okay, any questions? Yes.
Right after it says, and there was light, why we done it?
Good. That's a separate question. Any questions on what we just spoke about? Where's your sign? Thank you.
But it follows from what you just said, because one is speech and one is action. Let there be light is the speech of reality, and there was light is the action of reality.
Good. So in other words, God's speech was developed into reality instantly. Right? So in other words, it's really two steps. And that answers your question from before, that it's literally describing the two steps. It's describing the thought process of God and the immediate development into the physical world.
It doesn't say he had a thought process.
That's correct, because we only talk about the thought process because we have a thought process. God doesn't have a thought process. There's no thought process.
Why does he have them? I still don't get it.
Good. So when we talk about God's thought process, what we really mean to say is that God wills something into existence. Now, we may have a hard time wrapping our minds around that concept, but imagine the following. Imagine that you close your eyes. Don't imagine. Close your eyes. And think of a little boy running along a grass field, flying a kite. Now open your eyes. Where'd he go? That way. He's gone. He only had existence all the while that we gave him existence. As soon as we open up our eyes and we stop thinking about him, he's gone. Well, that's about the best we can do to understand how God and us relate to each other. God wills us into existence. We hope he doesn't open up his eyes anytime soon. Yes? Yes?
Okay, so we got the Torah because Moshe went up and he wrote it, God told him, and he wrote it. So was it God that said and God said, or did Moshe write and God said?
God told Moshe to write, and God said. Now the question is, why? And that's why we're here.
God needed a secretary.
So, when we talk about God willing us into existence, that's what we would call a thought process. Again, we're going to fail because we don't have the words to describe things that we don't fully understand. But, to the best degree possible, at least we can relate to the imagination concept. That all the while we can imagine something to that degree, it has existence. As soon as we stop thinking about that concept, it's gone. It does not have any existence. So when God says, quote unquote, Yehi Or, it's describing that God willed light into existence. When it says, let there be, he wasn't talking to someone that would produce the light for him. He was not talking to anyone. This is describing the process of creation. Vayomer is creating. Yehi is willing something into existence. Now, why is it important for us to know that he willed something into existence? It's very simple. Because we need to understand that everything that exists for a reason and a purpose. And it's not as though something popped into the world, oops, by mistake. Everything that God created, he willed into being with what we would call a conscious thought process. And that is very important for us to understand, because when we look around the world and we may have questions of, well, what does the appendix do if we could take it out? And the human form still seems to survive without it. Well, if we are so arrogant as to think that we have it all figured out, God will slowly but surely introduce us to realities that we never knew existed. And one day we will come to terms with why every element in the universe is necessary for the survival of whatever God wanted. Yes?
I'm not trying to be funny, but I can follow and understand the process about the thought. For example, the boy is a great one. What about when it says in some place or the other that God hears?
Good. It's the same thing. What we would describe as hearing is the process of either understanding or becoming aware of something. Now, we call it sometimes through hearing, sometimes through seeing. And we'll have to figure out, is there a difference between God becoming aware of something via seeing or via hearing? Interesting question. But again, it's all anthropomorphisms, meaning we are kind of dressing up God as a human only in order for us to bridge the divide that clearly a infinitesimal speck of transient matter, such as myself, and I'll speak for myself only, can relate to a divine being.
So, well, a couple of things. You said he willed it. He willed life. So, is that he didn't will the earth? He created
Well,
the earth.
that's a very interesting question, and I'll just mention to you. The question was, there's no Vayomer in the very beginning of creation. What happened to that Vayomer? It seems to be missing.
We haven't started creating yet.
Well, he did.
We haven't started organizing yet.
Well, organizing is different than creating. Creation has already begun.
Right.
So Dottie's asking an excellent question. So I will just present to you the way the Talmud understands the following statement. There's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, Chapters of Our Father, that says that God created the world with 10 utterances, 10 statements. And that we have begun to at least appreciate somewhat what that means. 10 utterances. What does it mean, an utterance? So the wording of the Mishnah is Be'asara ma'amarot. 10 ma'amarot. That word Amar, Vayomer, is found in that word. 10 statements, 10 utterances. That's how God created the world. And the Talmud says that if you take a look throughout creation, you will find that there are only 9 words, there are only 9 times that the word Vayomer features. So where is the 10th one? To which the Talmud says, Bereishis is also Vayomer. So, you have nailed that Gemara down on its head.
So we are giving God the power of speech or the ability to speak.
I would say the other way around. Man is granted the ability to speak, to be godlike in his ability to create.
Okay, so what does Vayomer mean? Utterance?
We'll talk after class. Okay, so another question. Yihi or. So again, there's a conscious willing into existence, which means that there's a purpose in this light, and indeed there's a purpose to everything that's created. In fact, somebody a number of weeks ago asked the question that every one of these psukim, every one of these verses begins with a vav. I forgot who asked it. Donald, was it you? Somebody pointed out that each one of these is a vav. And we mentioned at the time that the letter vav is and, that there's a link, that there's a progression of sorts. Well, that relates very much to this word yihi, because there is a flow, there's a conscious flow of the entirety of creation being developed step by step by step. Everything is linked to the thing previous to it. It is one long process of conscious planning and thought. So, if we are to draw a lesson from this process, we would understand that any project that we are to attempt to do has to have a lot of conscious planning and thought, thinking it through before we begin the process, and recognizing that every step of the way needs to be conscious, needs to fit into the overall plan, and therefore each step is going to be linked to the previous step. And that's literally what is unfolding in the process of creation. So we have here Yihi or, let there be light, and Vayihi or, and there was light. Now, nobody asked this question, and I understand why. No complaints. But if we take a look at day 2 of creation, which can be found on pages 6 and 7, specifically page 7, you take a look at the third line on page 7. What do you see? And it was so. Take a look at page 8, fourth line. And it was so. What? Page 7, third line, yes. And take a look at page 11, the first line. You're catching on. Okay? Vayichein. Vayichein, vayichein, vayichein. Over and over and over again. And it was so. The only one day that it doesn't say that is on the first day. Because really what it should say over here is, Vayomer Elokim, and God said, Ye are, Vayihi, Chain. And it was so. But that's not what it says. Why not? Excellent. So Corey is saying, because indeed it wasn't so. It was not going to last the way it was, we'll call it, supposed to. Now we didn't see the next verse in its fullness, in its totality, but we're going to find out that the light, the original light, the supernal light of creation, which was a spiritual light, which was way beyond the physical light that we know of today, that was not to last. And therefore the Torah specifically writes it in a way that indicates that it was not so. In other words, it was not stable and it was not permanent. In fact, the word in Hebrew for yes, no word. There is no word for yes. In fact, I don't know what yes means. Does anybody know what yes means?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, Y-E-T?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes?
Yes.
The opposite? No.
Yes.
I think your statement says you agree.
So it's an affirmation.
Affirmation.
An affirmation or a confirmation.
So, that's an affirmation.
Right? So you're affirming, you're confirming what is being said. So in Hebrew, yes. The what? Amen. Right. But in Hebrew, Cain is yes, affirmed. Now, where does that term come from? She'll say, right here. Vayihi Cain, and it was so. It was firmly established that way. It was confirmed. But interestingly enough, we have a verse in Parshas Ki Sisa in Shemos, Exodus chapter 30, verse 17. And you will not find it in our Chumash because we only have Bereishis. But I will say it extemporaneously. And that is that there we have a description of one of the implements, or one of the pieces of furniture, if we can call it that, of the Mishkan. And that was the kior. I believe in English it's the laver. The water laver? Lavier? Laver? Is that what it is? Laver. Thank you. So we have the kior. And it describes the ornate way that the fountain and the way the water comes out. But it talks about the kior, and it talks about another part of this piece called the kano, or kano. There's the kior and kano. Now, the kior is the actual laver. What's the kano? Kano is the base. It is what supports the actual water container. So the word kano comes from the word Cain. It is a foundation. It is a support. It is what allows it stability. So when we're talking about Vayihi Cain, and it was so, that's only because we don't have the ability in the English language to accurately define the word Cain. But really, Cain means this is the way it was. It was firmed up this way. It was stabilized this way. This is the way it was to last, to remain. And indeed, in this verse, we do not have that. And therefore, Vayihi Ar, and there was light, it is only a temporary state of this light. Which now leads us to understanding what this light was in this verse. And indeed, if it was not going to remain that way, clearly it can't be referring to the physical light that we know of.
So we'd be talking about Olam Haba.
Can we? We can, but perhaps that is a much deeper allusion rather than a simple reading of the verse.
Isn't that what Rabbi's saying? When he said, before, that's what he's saying, is that first light was too good for this world.
Well, not too good for this world.
Yeah, for the wicked, I guess.
Too good for the wicked, and therefore he set it apart for the righteous, for the world to come. Right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that light is referring to the world to come. That light will be operative in the world to come. Now, if we understand this light to be a supernal light, as the Talmud describes it, this is the type of light that Adam, the first human being, was able to see from one end of the world to the other. Now, for us, there's a problem to see from one end of the world to the other, because there's a world in between that prevents us from seeing from one end of the world to the other. So clearly, this type of light was able to penetrate through the veneer and to be able to see the essence of something. Now, this light's not really doing a good job showing me the essence of anything. In fact, all it shows me is the external. Right? Read last night's class. So, the notion of a light being a penetrating light, defining essence, really dovetails into our entire discussion of why it was created first. To give us the clarity of understanding the nature of things so that we know how to organize it all. The problem is that it didn't last. And the question that we need to ask ourselves, which we may not have time this week to discuss, is that good or is that bad? Was it a good thing to pull the light away, or was it a bad thing? So clearly you'll say, well, if God decided to do it, so it must be good. Well, from our perspective, wouldn't it be a lot easier to live in a world where we understood the essence of things instead of being duped by the way things look? In fact, is that not our problem every day of our lives? That we react to things based on how we see them instead of how they are? So it would seem like a terrible thing that's actually taking place here.
Except that the light is in the world to come. I mean, there's still a purpose for that.
There's no question that there's a purpose. The question is, what was the purpose of introducing it only to pull it away, and are we left in the dark, literally and figuratively?
Well, it depends on what you do our purpose.
Okay.
But it's also creation. I mean, you maybe started creation here, but the creation may only be physical in this world. There probably is more creation after.
More creation after what?
I guess that might be the world to come.
Good. So that already...
Well, now you also have the world to come, possibly.
Good.
But we're also left in the dark to find the light.
That's correct. And it's a very important point. Yes.
Well, you said before that we're supposed to redefine and take it to apply to our lives and how we can learn from it. And so that's really the best learning because we're not supposed to understand everything.
Good. So there's definitely an element, and we're going to be introduced to that over and over again, that we're not going to understand everything. And as I mentioned in one of the earlier classes, that one of the key elements of the study of Torah is humility. And sometimes we're forced to reckon with our lack of ability of understanding things. In fact, considering the fact that it is Hanukkah, we do have to mention something relating to Hanukkah. And the entire notion of science and Greek culture and philosophy, we're seeing it today over and over again, and that is that the scientific realm generates a lot of arrogance. Because the more we discover, the more powerful we seem to think we are. You know, as soon as the Human Genome Project was completed a number of years ago, you know, that scared a lot of people. You know, that's when all these discussions of ethics, of playing God, etc., and how human beings now have full control over how to do things. Well, it's interesting how to date they still haven't figured out how to clone anything. But there was a lot of talk about how we are so powerful and we can now create things. So other than Jurassic Park, you know, genetic cloning and DNA discoveries are far, far from developing to the degree that they claim it is developed. But it is natural to consider that within the next decade, they may have an ability to do this. Every step of the way, we are challenged to remember who is in control. And God is always one step ahead. And He will always be one step ahead, because He's God. And it's interesting how, to me, for those of you who are familiar with quantum physics, and I won't get into detail, but quantum physics, to me, is God sticking out His tongue at us. Because, in essence, quantum physics has, just to simplify and just to kind of isolate it in a nutshell, what is it? One of the things that they discovered is that what they thought was the orbit of an electron, we thought we knew where it was. Well, now they've come to recognize that there's a realm of possibility of where exactly it is. What's even worse is that if two people are watching it, what this person sees and what that person sees, we could see it in two different places at the same time. Which doesn't make any sense, because it either is there and isn't there, or isn't there and is there. But it can't be in both places at once. And yet they have done experiment after experiment to show how one electron seems to take on a life of its own and can be seen in two different places depending on how the observer relates to it. Now, of course, they're all up in arms because they can't figure it out, because it doesn't fit according to the rules of physics the way we know it. Well, what do you do then? There you go. Change the rule of physics, or claim that it's true we don't understand it yet. But as we get more sophisticated machinery and ability to measure and identify, we will yet figure it out. Another very interesting thing. To me, it's just alarming. There's a holy grail in mathematics. Anybody know what it is? Pi. Pi. Now, 159. So what is pi? Pi is the area of a circle. Now, to compute the area of a square, length times width. 2 and 2. 2 times 2 is 4. I know exactly how much is in this square. Now, for some reason, when I order a pie of pizza, I cannot tell you how much pizza is in this pie, because I don't know what pie is. Right. Good. So, the notion of not being able to understand how much is in this circle doesn't really make sense to us. Because if you can figure out a square, then why can't you figure out a circle? Well, so what do the mathematicians say? We're going to compute to whatever degree we can. And it's only because we don't have sophisticated enough machinery to compute it that's the problem. Well, I read an article recently that a couple of people in Japan put together about 200 supercomputers to be able to fuse all the computing power of all these computers to be able to figure out what pi is. Well, that string of numbers that comes after the 14159 continues, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the number is at 50 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Even if it's 50 million, fine. So, they're stuck. They hit a world record for discovering how many numbers come after the decimal point. But that means that they still haven't figured out how much is in this circle. Well, it's perplexing until you read a statement from the Jerusalem Talmud that says that in nature there are no squares. In nature there are circles. Squares represent man's contribution by building, manufacturing, engineering, creating man-made things. Roundness, circles, represents God's domain. Now perhaps we can understand why there is a holy grail in mathematics. And perhaps there will never be an answer to how much is in there, because God, in a certain sense, is saying, you will never catch up. And to me, it's astounding, because in the Greek world, in Hellenistic culture, science was there as a means of understanding the world, because the more we understand the world, the more in control of the world we are, and the less we need God. It was actually to create a godless existence. And here we're told that God has to will everything into existence in order for it to remain. So the conflict of science and Torah is very much not like what people think it is. Age of the universe, how does it all work out? Forget about that. The real conflict between science and Torah is, do you believe that there's something beyond which you can see, beyond which you can measure, beyond which you can understand, or is there not? The Greeks believed the ultimate is in the human mind, and what man can perceive is real, and if you can't understand it, or if you can't measure it, you can't see it, it does not exist. Whereas the Jews were fighting for a recognition of that all the elements in this world can be studied in great detail as long as you don't sever the link between the physical world that we live in and the God willing it into existence at every moment, to recognize that there is a God that animates and has created everything. And that was the Greeks versus the Jews, science versus Torah, a godless existence versus a God-filled existence. Good night.